From the Tower of Darkness is probably the best fictional work by Poke Runyon, except some short piece that I can't quite recollect. Or if Commando X or Night Jump Cuba was better written, then that would be the case. Now, this book is provoked by the perceptions of a supposed Islamic fundamentalist boogeyman, which is refuted by the documentary that I saw at the beginning of 2001. I think it was CNN or some channel like that went over how Al-Qaeda wasn't a terrorist organization. It was just a bunch of war vets. And if these people are supposed to be Islamic fundamentalist, that means something different in Islam than it does in Christianity, where, you kill people for blasphemy and all that other stuff because the Bible told you to do. Islam says to ignore the blasphemers and never fight anybody because they disbelieve and don't conquer for land and all that other stuff. So these people who thought, that they supposedly had the right to conquer anybody because they were a disbelieving people, they were in the wrong too. So, kind of stepping aside from this thing of only blaming the Europeans for their massacres. And this book doesn't actually represent any particular religious or secular order or individual. It is, for the most part, one of those historical fictions, you could say, in that there was a real period that they were looking at when thinking of, but it wasn't what went on in that period. But it's the sort of thing that if you heard about that period and you didn't know about it, then you might think that some of this stuff happened. Now, it says that the Pickthall translation of the Quran was used. Some verses were skipped over in the arguments. I'm not sure why that is. I kind of felt like, some points were made or left out because of that. Like is so often the case that, you find some issues and it's actually not there in the original. I mean, even the Bible, hundreds of the issues, there's thousands of issues with the Bible, but hundreds of the issues are fixed when you actually read it in Greek for yourself and you read it in Aramea, as, the biblical Hebrew was called by the people who spoke it. Surah 15 of the Quran is explained in Surah 26 when they pray to be saved from the evil influence and the effects of the evil. So therefore, in that context, you can't say that Lot was handing over his daughters to be abused like that other story that you don't hear too much in the Bible, where the guy gets, he throws his wife and daughter to the crowd and they get gang raped all night. And then he's like, oh, I don't want you anymore, and chops them up and offers a piece of the sacrifice to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. I forget exactly what verse that is, but it's pretty easy to search with the internet. I'm talking here rather than going by verse source. I make my conclusions and I don't necessarily articulate them as well as I would like on the spot. But and also it does that verse. He says, "Oh, if you want to do this sort of thing, I have unmarried daughters." So the actual implication was that he was not handing them over. So, some words that were inserted in the translation or something to make it, to give it context, probably because of the biblical background. But anyways, people would argue with Scripture. And that's important enough, because people who argue with philosophy are their own ramblings. it's not any more respectable, and sometimes it's just, oh, well, that's just what you say, and it's like, fine, you listen to what some people say, but and you see certain people's code of honor. They can murder, but they can't, violate, and some people get threatened, and some people are like, I understand why this would have been the sort of thing that, before this came out, because this is 2002. I would have not been allowed when I was younger to read this sort of thing, and I definitely see from Poke Runyon's writings why the pulp fiction was something that was discouraged. And I don't remember what Bundy said, but I was young enough when Bundy was going through his trials that when I got older, it would have been, if that sort of thing would have been heard about, it would have been used as a reason. See what can happen? It probably won't happen, but it can. And because I don't necessarily think he was making a statement about religion itself, but, certainly some people. Because, he was a Green Beret and traveled and some stuff like that, so he would have encountered people that's like, oh, it's prayer time, got to get away so people don't notice that I'm not praying. But if you're there, then you got to pray. But as far as spiritually and everything else, you did kind of get the perception from this book that the Europeans were a worse sort. It's like, why are you down in some other country in the first place, right? But if they could go up, some of these people would have, conquered just to conquer the infidel or whatever they would have said. And the Muslims would have known that, womanizing and drug use of even coffee and cigarettes would have, not been allowed. But, those aren't the worst sins per se, but how some people are. Obviously, the wars of conquest and tribal warfare and stuff was a worse thing. But just because somebody does a worse thing doesn't mean they have to indulge in all the other stuff too. There is an air of so-called cultural superiority implied when they say, oh, a modern crusade versus a medieval jihad. Well, the medieval jihad, which means something different in Arabic than it does in English, implies, certain ethics. It implies they didn't go to war to fight for conquest. It's like, how did the Turkish Empire fall? Oh, people say guns and germs and steel or some other argument. I had a neighbor that would argue from this guns, germs, and steel book. But really what happened is it became clear to the populace that the Turkish Empire was fighting for land. And the decade that people started to have that perception, rather than fighting to spread freedom or just be safe as a country, whatever sections there were, the empire started to shrink. You had people that tried to get out of going to war rather than the honor of volunteering to fight to defend yourself. That, oh, the Muslims are being attacked over here, or there's this religious community over yonder that is asked for our protection. Let's go fight for them. But yeah, this idea that, oh, one group fights to convert, the other group fights to convert. They're both lost. Whether you're part of a faith or not, there is some honor in knowing something about the faith, even knowing something of its verses and rituals. If you're going to take on a persona, then you got to act the part. Like, you don't dress up like somebody who's performed a pilgrimage or who is a priest or whatever, and then you just don't like and that the same thing really should go for the clergy, that they become clergy, but they're not really believers. Or they're going for the highest bidders. Like, oh, I can't be a preacher because I found a job that earns more. Well, perhaps you can take that job that earns more and write a sermon once a week. Oh, sure, you might have to give up a half an hour or an hour TV show every day to come in on Sunday and lead everybody. But, didn't you get it in, to serve God or, and not just those who, are fighting each other, are in the areas that are conquered. Well, maybe the areas that are conquered, but, innocent people that have accomplished great things in learning and deeds and stuff get caught up in wars. And of course, there's a lot of techniques, you could say, that could be pointed out. From intelligence to, symbolistic popular religion, as people would call it, implied in the book.